I did not say a word when they left me alone on Christmas, but that silence changed everything. I remember sitting there in seat 2A, the kind of seat I used to scroll past online thinking it was for people with completely different lives, holding a glass of champagne I did not even ask for, watching the cabin lights dim as the plane prepared for takeoff, and thinking about how quiet everything felt, not just around me but inside me too, like something had finally settled after being restless for a long time. A few days earlier, none of this existed, not the ticket, not the decision, not even the thought that I would be anywhere other than home for Christmas. Olivia had been moving around the apartment that week like everything was normal, asking me if we needed more wrapping paper, if I remembered to grab the cinnamon rolls she liked, if I could help carry a couple of boxes up from her car. And I said yes to all of it because that was what I always did. I filled in the gaps, I made things smoother, I made things easier, even when something felt slightly off and I could not quite explain why. Maybe it was the way she kept checking her phone, smiling at messages she did not share, or the way she answered my questions a half-second too late, like she had to come back from somewhere else before responding, but I told myself I was overthinking because that is what I had been doing for months, convincing myself that small things were just small things and not signs of something bigger. Christmas Eve came in quietly, no arguments, no tension, just that same strange distance that had become normal, and I remember asking her what time her friends were coming over because that had been the plan, a small group, some drinks, maybe a movie, something simple, and she paused for a second before saying they might be running late, and I nodded like that made sense even though something about it did not. Hours passed, the kind of slow, stretched out hours where you keep expecting a message or a knock on the door, and I stayed busy straightening things that were already straight, checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit, until eventually the truth arrived, not as a conversation but as a notification. A photo posted online, Olivia smiling in a crowded living room somewhere else, surrounded by people I recognized, holding a drink, looking completely at ease, like she had not left anything unfinished behind. I stared at that photo longer than I should have, not because it was shocking but because it was clarifying, like something I had been trying not to see had finally come into focus, and in that moment I realized it was not just about Christmas, it was about every time I had adjusted, every time I had waited, every time I had chosen to stay quiet instead of asking the question I already knew the answer to. I did not call her, I did not text, I did not react the way I thought I would. Instead I just sat there in the quiet apartment with the lights still on and the food untouched, and for the first time in a long time I let the silence be exactly what it was, not something to fix, not something to escape, but something to listen to. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt steady and irreversible, like I had finally reached the end of something without even realizing I had been walking toward it for so long. Back in seat 2A, as the plane began to move, I leaned back and closed my eyes for a second, not to sleep, just to feel the distance growing, not just in miles but in everything else that had been holding me in place, and for the first time I was not wondering what she was doing or why she had left, I was only thinking about where I was going and how I had gotten here. And the answer was simpler than I expected. I stopped waiting and started choosing. The flight leveled out somewhere above the clouds, and I found myself staring at the soft glow of the cabin lights reflecting off the window, thinking about how different everything looked from up here, like the details that once felt overwhelming had shrunk into something distant and quiet. A flight attendant asked if I wanted another drink, and I nodded without thinking, not because I needed it, but because for once I was not calculating or hesitating. I was just choosing something for myself without wondering how it would affect anyone else. That feeling was unfamiliar, almost strange, because for the longest time my decisions had been shaped around Olivia, around what she preferred, what she expected, what would keep things smooth between us. I used to believe that was what a good relationship looked like, adjusting, accommodating, making space for the other person, but somewhere along the way I stopped noticing how much space I was giving up. I remembered small moments that did not seem important at the time, like when we would go out to dinner and she would scroll through her phone while I talked, nodding without really hearing me, or when I would suggest something simple like watching a movie together and she would say maybe later, and later would never come. None of those moments felt big enough to confront, so I let them pass, telling myself it was not worth turning into an issue, that relationships had phases, that things would circle back eventually. But sitting there now, miles above everything, I realized those moments had been adding up quietly, shaping something I had not wanted to name. My phone buzzed on the tray table, breaking that train of thought, and I did not even need to look to know who it was, but I still glanced down, and there it was, Olivia's name lighting up the screen. There were multiple messages, stacked one after another, asking where I was, why I was not answering, what was going on, and I stared at them without opening a single one, not out of anger but out of clarity. For the first time, I was not pulled into responding, not pulled into explaining myself, not pulled into fixing something that I had not broken. I turned the phone face down and let it sit there. And the silence that followed felt different from the silence of that night. It was not heavy or confusing, it was steady, almost grounding. I leaned back in the seat and looked around at the other passengers, people who were sleeping, reading, watching movies, each of them in their own world, and I wondered how many of them had made a decision like this, a quiet shift that changed everything without anyone else noticing right away. I thought about how easy it would have been to stay, to wait for her to come back, to have the conversation I had rehearsed in my head so many times, to give her another chance to explain or apologize or promise something different. But I also knew exactly how that would have ended because I had seen that pattern before, not in one big moment, but in all the small ones that led up to it. The plane moved forward steadily, and I felt that same forward motion inside me. Not rushed, not forced, just a clear sense that I was no longer standing still waiting for someone else to decide what came next. I picked up the menu in front of me, something I would normally ignore, and actually read through it, considering what I wanted instead of defaulting to something simple. And it seemed like such a small thing, but it felt significant, like a reminder that I still had a say in my own life. Another vibration from my phone came and went, but I did not reach for it this time because whatever was being said on the other side of that screen no longer carried the same weight it used to. I was not trying to prove anything, I was not trying to make a point, I was simply stepping out of something that had already been slipping away for a long time, and as the cabin lights dimmed further and the hum of the engine settled into a steady rhythm, I realized that this was not just a trip. It was the first time in a long time that I was moving forward without looking back to see if someone else was coming with me. The announcement for descent came sooner than I expected, and as the seatbelt sign turned on, I realized how quickly the distance had grown between where I was and where I had been just hours earlier, not just in miles but in everything that used to feel fixed in place. I glanced out the window and saw the faint outline of a coastline coming into view, city lights scattered like small constellations, and for a moment I tried to remember the last time I had felt this kind of quiet anticipation about something that was entirely my own decision. My phone buzzed again, more aggressively now, and this time I picked it up not to respond but to finally see what had been building on the other side. The messages had shifted from confusion to frustration, from asking where I was to questioning why I would disappear like this, and then to something that almost sounded like concern, but even that felt layered with an expectation that I would answer, that I would explain, that I would return to the role I had always played. I read through a few of them slowly, not rushing, not reacting, just observing the tone, the words, the way everything was framed, and I noticed something I had not fully seen before. It was never about understanding me, it was about regaining control of the situation. That realization did not make me angry, it just made things clearer. Like finally seeing the full shape of something that had been partially hidden. I locked the phone and set it aside again, and this time there was no hesitation at all, just a steady certainty that I did not owe an immediate response to something that had taken so long to unravel. As the plane continued its descent, I thought about what it would feel like to land somewhere new without carrying the same weight I had been carrying before. And it was not about escaping anything, it was about finally allowing space for something different to exist. I felt that same grounded feeling settle in, not the kind that comes from routine, but the kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you decided to be. When we finally came to a stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, I reached for my bag and my phone at the same time, holding it for a moment before unlocking the screen, and there it was again, more messages, more missed calls, but this time I did not scroll, I did not read further, I did not let myself get pulled back into something I had already stepped away from. Instead, I opened the settings, paused just long enough to recognize what I was about to do, and then blocked the number without hesitation, without a second thought, not as a reaction, but as a decision that had been forming long before this moment. I slipped the phone into my pocket and stood up with the rest of the passengers, moving forward in line step by step toward the exit, and as I walked off the plane and into the terminal, the air felt different, not because of where I was, but because of what I had finally let go of, and for the first time in a long time there was nothing pulling me backward, nothing waiting for me to respond, nothing left unfinished in the way it used to be, just a clear open space ahead shaped entirely by what I chose to do next. The terminal was quieter than I expected for a holiday morning, or maybe it just felt that way because everything inside me had finally slowed down, like the constant background noise I had gotten used to was no longer there. I followed the signs toward baggage claim, even though I had only brought a single carry-on, more out of habit than necessity, moving through the space without rushing, without checking my phone, without that familiar sense that I needed to be somewhere else or respond to someone waiting on the other side. The automatic door slid open as I stepped outside, and the air hit differently, cooler, sharper, carrying a kind of clarity that matched the way my thoughts had begun to settle. A line of cars idled along the curb, drivers checking their phones, people greeting each other with quick hugs, luggage wheels rolling across the pavement, and for a moment I just stood there, taking it in, not as an observer of other people's lives, but as someone who had finally stepped back into his own. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, not out of habit this time but intentionally, opening it to a clean screen. No missed calls, no unread messages, no notifications pulling me in different directions, just silence, and it felt lighter than I expected, like removing something I did not realize had weight. For a brief second, a thought crossed my mind, not doubt exactly, but a quiet curiosity about what would have happened if I had answered, if I had stayed, if I had chosen the familiar path instead of this one. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, a recognition that I had already played that version out in my head too many times, and it had always led back to the same place. A car pulled up in front of me, the driver rolling down the window to confirm my name, and I nodded, placing my bag in the back seat before sliding in, the door closing with a soft, final sound that felt more symbolic than it should have. As we pulled away from the airport, the city started to unfold around me, streets lined with palm trees, early morning light reflecting off buildings, people moving through their day without any awareness of the shift that had just taken place in mine. And I found a strange comfort in that. The idea that not everything needed to be witnessed or validated to be real. Backward, no expectation waiting at the other end. It was not about cutting something off in a dramatic way. It was about stepping fully into something else without leaving part of myself behind. For my phone or start a conversation or find something to occupy my mind. But now the quiet felt different. It felt earned. Like something I had stepped into rather than something I was trying to escape. I thought about how many times I had waited for Olivia to respond, how many times I had paused my own plans just in case she reached out, how many times I had adjusted my schedule around the possibility of her availability, and it was not that those choices were wrong at the time, it was that I had kept making them long after they stopped being mutual. No audience, no expectation, just the moment itself, and it felt more complete that way. I stayed there for a while, letting the time pass without tracking it, until the sun shifted slightly higher and the light changed, casting longer shadows across the buildings below, and I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle in again, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady presence that had been building since I left. I went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed, taking a deep breath without even thinking about it, and I noticed how natural that felt too, like my body was catching up to a decision my mind had already made. There was no urge to go back, no lingering question about whether I had done the right thing, just a calm understanding that I had finally aligned my actions with something I had been feeling for a long time. I reached for the room key on the table and turned it over in my hand for a moment, a small simple object that represented where I was now, not where I had been, and I realized that this was not just about leaving a situation, it was about stepping into a version of my life where I was no longer waiting for permission to exist fully in it, and that was something I was not willing to give up again. Made me uneasy, like I needed to reach for my phone or start a conversation or find something to occupy my mind, but now the quiet felt different. It felt earned, like something I had stepped into rather than something I was trying to escape. I thought about how many times I had waited for Olivia to respond, how many times I had paused my own plans just in case she reached out, how many times I had adjusted my schedule around the possibility of her availability, and it was not that those choices were wrong at the time, it was that I had kept making them long after they stopped being mutual. That realization did not come with regret, it came with a kind of understanding that made it easier to let go of the need to revisit it. I stood up and finally opened my bag, taking out a few things and placing them neatly on the dresser, not rushing, not overthinking, just moving through simple actions that felt more intentional than usual. There was something grounding about it, the act of putting things in place without distraction, without interruption, just being present with what I was doing. Moved through my own life. Now there was no audience, no expectation, just the moment itself, and it felt more complete that way. I stayed there for a while, letting the time pass without tracking it, until the sun shifted slightly higher and the light changed, casting longer shadows across the buildings below, and I felt a quiet sense of clarity settle in again, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady presence that had been building since I left. I went back inside and sat on the edge of the bed, taking a deep breath without even thinking about it, And I noticed how natural that felt too, like my body was catching up to a decision my mind had already made. There was no urge to go back, no lingering question about whether I had done the right thing, just a calm understanding that I had finally aligned my actions with something I had been feeling for a long time. I reached for the room key on the table and turned it over in my hand for a moment, a small simple object that represented where I was now, not where I had been, and I realized that this was not just about leaving a situation, it was about stepping into a version of my life where I was no longer waiting for permission to exist fully in it, and that was something I was not willing to give up again. By the time the afternoon settled in, I realized I had not checked the time once, not because I forgot, but because it did not matter in the same way it used to, and that alone felt like a quiet shift I had been needing for a long time. I left the room without a specific plan, just a general intention to step outside and see where the day would take me, something I would not have done before without coordinating it with someone else or at least mentioning it, but now there was no one to inform, no one to align with, just my own sense of direction. The hotel lobby was calm, a few people moving through it with the same unspoken ease, and I walked past the front desk without stopping, pushing open the glass doors and stepping out into the sunlight. The air was warmer now, carrying the low hum of the city, distant conversations, the sound of traffic blending into something almost rhythmic, and I started walking without choosing a destination, letting instinct guide me instead of a plan. It was a simple thing, but it felt unfamiliar in the best way, like rediscovering a part of myself that had been overshadowed by routine and expectation. I passed by small cafes, storefronts, people sitting outside talking over coffee, and for a moment I considered stopping, but I kept walking not because I was avoiding anything but because I wanted to keep moving, to stay in that flow a little longer. Eventually I reached a stretch of the waterfront, where the city opened up and the horizon came back into view, and I slowed down, stepping closer to the edge where the sound of the water replaced the noise behind me. I leaned against the railing again, similar to earlier, but this time it felt different, not like a pause, but like a continuation of something that was unfolding naturally. I watched the waves move in a steady pattern, and I realized how rare it had been for me to just observe something without attaching a thought to it, without comparing it to anything else, without needing to turn it into something meaningful or productive. My phone stayed in my pocket the entire time, and I did not feel the urge to reach for it, not out of discipline but out of genuine disinterest, like whatever was happening on that screen no longer had the same pull it once did. I thought about how much of my attention had been tied to maintaining something that was slowly pulling away from me, and how I had mistaken that effort for commitment, when in reality it had been a form of quiet imbalance that I had learned to normalize. Standing there now, I could see that more clearly than ever, not as something to be upset about, but as something I had outgrown without realizing it. A couple walked past me laughing about something I could not hear, and I noticed the ease between them, the way their conversation flowed without effort, and instead of comparing it to what I had, I simply acknowledged it and let it pass, understanding that what I was looking for in my life needed to feel just as natural, not forced, not negotiated, not constantly questioned. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting a softer light across the water, and I took a deep breath, feeling the moment settle into something that did not need to be captured or remembered in any specific way, just experienced fully while it was happening. I stayed there longer than I planned, if there was even a plan to begin with, and when I finally turned to walk back, it was not because I felt done, but because I felt complete for the moment, like I had taken something in without needing to hold on to it. The walk back to the hotel felt lighter, not physically, but in the way my thoughts moved, no longer circling back to the same questions, no longer replaying the same scenarios, just moving forward in a straight, uninterrupted line. When I stepped back into the room and closed the door behind me, the quiet returned again, but this time it felt familiar, almost welcome, like something I was beginning to understand rather than something I needed to fill. And I realized that this was what it meant to truly be present, not distracted, not divided, just fully there in a way I had not been in a very long time. The next morning arrived quietly, without urgency, without the familiar pull of something unfinished waiting for me to address, and I woke up not because of an alarm or a notification, but because my body felt ready to move into the day. For a few seconds I stayed still, looking at the ceiling, letting the awareness of where I was settle in again, not as something surprising, but as something steady, something I had chosen and now fully occupied. I got up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain back to let the light in, and the view looked different in the morning, clearer, more defined, like everything had shifted into focus overnight. And I realized that the same thing had happened internally, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, consistent alignment that made everything feel more grounded. I made a cup of coffee using the small machine in the room, taking my time with each step, not rushing through it, not multitasking, just being present with something simple. And when I took the first sip, I noticed how different it felt to actually experience something without dividing my attention, without thinking about what came next. My phone remained on the nightstand and I did not reach for it right away, not because I was avoiding it, but because it no longer held the same priority it once did. When I eventually picked it up, it was with intention, unlocking it slowly, scanning the screen without urgency, and there was nothing new that changed anything, nothing that pulled me back, nothing that made me question the decision I had already made. It felt complete in a way that did not need reinforcement. I set the phone down again and stepped out onto the balcony, the morning air lighter, carrying the quiet energy of a new day that had not yet been shaped, and I leaned against the railing, looking out at the city as it began to wake up. People moved with purpose below, starting their routines, stepping into their own responsibilities, and I felt a sense of distance from that in the best way, not disconnected, but free from the weight of expectations that were never truly mine to carry. I thought about everything that had led to this moment, not in detail, not replaying events, but in a broader sense, recognizing the pattern that had defined so much of my time before, and how easily I had accepted it without realizing what it was costing me. There was no anger left, no frustration, just clarity, and that clarity made it easier to see that the decision I had made was not sudden. It was the result of something that had been building quietly over time, waiting for the moment I was willing to act on it. I went back inside, got dressed, and prepared to step out into the day again, but this time with a different mindset, not just moving through the environment, but actively choosing how I wanted to experience it. I left the room without checking my phone, without thinking about what might be waiting there, and as I walked through the hallway and into the lobby, I felt that same steady sense of direction guiding me, not toward a specific destination, but toward a way of living that felt more aligned with who I was becoming. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer, the air more alive, and I started walking again, this time with a clearer sense of presence, noticing the details around me without needing to attach meaning to them, just letting them exist as part of the experience. At some point I paused, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to, standing still in the middle of a moment that did not require anything from me, and I realized that this was what I had been missing, not just in the relationship, but in how I had been living overall, the ability to exist fully in my own life without constantly adjusting to something else. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the simplicity of that action, the quiet certainty behind it, and I understood that this was not about proving anything, not about making a statement or showing someone what they had lost. It was about choosing myself in a way that did not depend on anyone else's recognition or response. As I continued walking, there was a sense of forward motion that felt natural, unforced, like I was no longer carrying something that had been slowing me down, and for the first time in a long time, I was not looking back to see if anything or anyone was following. I was simply moving ahead, fully aware that this path, whatever it turned into, belonged entirely to me.